Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for registering for this important event that we are holding here in Washington, D.C. at the Global Policy Institute, which is a think tank, nonpartisan and non-political, and we are associated and affiliated with Bay Atlantic University, a private university in downtown Washington, D.C. For those of you who don't know about us, we're right downtown, very close to Lafayette Park and the White House, for whatever it's worth, in terms of location. So we are very fortunate today to have with us a major expert on a very complicated subject that for most, lay people may appear intricate and confusing. Let me just say a couple of words and then I yield to Irina Tsukerman, who is our distinguished expert, who really knows a lot about all these matters regarding case studies, but particularly she's an international law expert and a refugee law expert, and she will tell us the details about all this. So everybody knows about refugees, probably at least that's something one has heard, right? Oh, they're refugees because maybe sometimes it's because of humanitarian disasters, there was a big flood, there was a hurricane, there was something. We got situations of maybe temporary refugees here in the United States. Just in the news, if you watched, what's happened in the last few days, there have been major floods in Texas. So obviously this causes a lot of dislocation. Unfortunately, I'm sure many people, at least temporarily, lost their homes. And so they're kind of refugee. I mean, I wouldn't use the term refugee in a technical sense, but basically there are people in need of shelter, in need of food, clean water, first aid, you name it, clean clothes, blankets, whatever. So that I wouldn't call them refugees in the generally accepted understanding of the term. But then some of you at least know about wars and about tragedies that are ongoing around the world. There's a major conflict in Sudan that has caused a lot of dislocation, millions of internally displaced people, that is, people who are still maybe within the country but lost their homes, had to move to a different part of the country to escape from violence and bombing and killing and whatnot. Again, there was the issue, which still there, of Syria. Millions of refugees who escaped from the many, many years of civil war and strife in that country. There are refugees, if you come to this hemisphere, from Venezuela, people escaping poverty and tyranny from Venezuela, and they peeled off and they went to neighboring countries, be it Colombia, or Peru, or Brazil, and on and on. We're not going to make the whole list. But in all this, it seems almost forgotten that there has been an unfortunate tragedy which has unfolded over decades, really, and which has to do with a conflict between two neighboring countries, which both of them used to be part of the old Soviet Union, Armenia and Azerbaijan. And again, I don't want here to take too much time because I really want to yield to our expert. And I would like her to start telling us two things, both in terms of general international law applicable to the circumstances. And if she can kindly explain to us who are not so well versed about the intricacies of this conflict, what happened, how far back it goes, because the issue that we're discussing today goes quite far back, and what does that mean, and what are the options for redress for people who were, penalized, losing everything, their homes, their belongings, and who were had to leave the country. In the country here being Armenia. So, Irina, again, welcome to you. And thank you so much for being with us. And the floor is yours.
you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. Just to get started, I'll a really concise background there on the history of the displacement of Azerbaijanis from Armenia, and then I'll move on to discuss the legal issues. I'll try to do it in very simple, understandable terms. I know lawyers like to use a lot of legal jargon. I will try to avoid that. So, prior to the 20th century, the South Caucasus was a mosaic of ethnic and religious communities, which included large populations of Azerbaijanis, who were often also sometimes historically referred to as Caucasian Tatars, who lived in what is now the Republic of Armenia. Cities and regions such as Yerevan, as it was known at that time, and now more familiar as Yerevan, Zangezur, and Goicha, were home to vibrant Azerbaijani communities. So, what was responsible for sort of exacerbating ethnic tensions were the Russian imperial policies in the 19th century, particularly following something called the Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828, which encouraged the resettlement of Armenians from the Ottoman and Persian empires into the Caucasus. This was an early case of demographic engineering, which gradually shifted the ethnic balance in favor of Armenians in some of the regions, often at the expense of Muslim populations. And we will later find that the Soviet Union used very much the same policies to exacerbate the crisis between ethnicities within its borders. So what happened from 1905 to 1920? There was a growth in rising nationalism and inter-ethnic violence. Pogroms erupted between the two communities inside the Russian Empire. There was an Armenian Azerbaijani War of 1918 through 1920, and at that point, thousands of Azerbaijanis were expelled or killed in areas like Zangezur and Yerevan. Then the newly formed First Republic of Armenia pursued policies that led to the forced displacement of Azerbaijani Muslims. At that point, entire villages were destroyed, populations were driven into exile. And this was the first large scale ethnic cleansing of Azerbaijanis from Armenian territories, but by no means the last. During the Soviet period, suppression and silent displacement continued. Overt ethnic violence was officially suppressed, but demographic shifts continued and led to outbursts of violence later. The Soviet government withdrew borders and created autonomous regions that often sowed future discord, and that was a deliberate policy aimed at controlling populations. Azerbaijanis remained a significant minority in the Armenian SSR, numbering over 160,000 people by the 1979 census. The census, of course, in the Soviet Union was not necessarily reliable, but that is the best that we have. They were politically marginalized. Periodic tensions took place, but mass displacement was largely avoided until the late 1980s, and which brings us to the first Karabakh crisis and the infamous mass expulsions that many are more familiar with. This took place between 1988 and 1991. The collapse of the Soviet Union unleashed long suppressed nationalist movements. In 1988, the Armenian population of what was then known as Nagorno-Karabakh, which was a region created by the Soviet Union inside the territory of the Karabakh region, demanded unification with Armenia, triggering violent reprisals and pogroms. Uh, and this led to anti-Azerbaijani violence in Armenia, including in cities like Gugark and Yerevan. So, in that period of time, those few years, nearly the entire Azerbaijani population of Armenia, over 200,000 people at least, was expelled or fled under threat. Their homes were seized or destroyed, and cultural sites desecrated or repurposed as homes or other infrastructure for the Armenian population. Since the early 1990s, Armenia has remained almost entirely monoethnic. No formal mechanisms for return were instituted, no restitution was enabled, and no compensation established. The displaced Azerbaijanis relocated to Azerbaijan and became refugees, suffering from economic hardships and psychological trauma.
Sorry,
They've been denied.
can I interrupt you for a second so that everybody can really understand exactly? So this problem precedes the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? We're talking about
Yes, it's an
when these were
100-year-old problem,
yeah.
over
So
100 years.
it's a very complicated issue of populations having been moved here, moved there, new ethnic groups introduced by the Tsarist regime way back in the 19th century, and then you got all this stuff. So that we can understand some critical milestones. So the problem of the ethnic Azerbaijani who lived in Armenia, exploded, as you indicated, in 1988. Am I correct?
Yes, although there have been periods even before that, such as in prior around 1918, when there was the first wave of displacement, by the way. So this was not, the 1988 was the best known and the biggest explosion of violence, where most Azerbaijanis, the overwhelming majority, was expelled. But before that, there were other waves of violence and expulsions. So this problem goes back a century. It's not new. The Soviet Union essentially continued the Tsarist policies in that respect and kind of contributed, and deliberately very much so, to this problem.
But let me ask again, please forgive me, because as a layperson, at the time in 1988, since there was still a Soviet Union, all these
Correct.
people, right, regardless of the republic where they lived within the Soviet Union, they were all Soviet citizens, right? So there were no, I mean, while these were different republics within the Soviet Union as a federal state, they were all Soviet citizens, correct? So it was not like the expulsion. It was an expulsion. I'm not trying to challenge that, but it was not going from one country to another. I don't know if that makes any difference compared to other situations closer to us chronologically. In other words, if today, or when there was the height of the civil war in Syria, and there were millions of Syrians who, to escape from the civil war, moved over to Turkey, well, that's going from one country to another. In this particular case, did it make any difference, the fact that both at the time, Armenia and Azerbaijan, both of them were Soviet republics? Did that make any difference, or it's irrelevant?
At that point, it does make a difference. It complicates the claims of both entities, making claims about restitution and so forth. And I'll get to that when I get to the legal point of the discussion. From a political standpoint, it didn't make an iota of difference, because people still lost their homes. Whether it was the Soviet government that was officially responsible because the buck stopped with Moscow, or whether it was the local Armenian authorities, made little difference to the people who were expelled. They lost everything and had to flee to a place where they were new, and yes, they were accepted in Azerbaijan, it's true, but at the same time, they had been living in Armenia for decades, and they left with nothing, and the government, the local authorities had to scramble to find them a place to live. Now, the Autonomous Republic of Azerbaijan under the Soviet Union is not the Azerbaijan we know today. It was far less developed. It had economic issues of its own, which were exacerbated by the occupation in the 1990s. So it was actually a serious economic hardship to relocate hundreds of thousands of refugees from another location, even though it was technically within the territory of the Soviet Union. Culturally, there were, of course, differences, and of course, the Soviet Union deliberately created tensions and problems and misused local nationalism. in a very duplicitous way. On the one hand, claiming that all the Soviet citizens were equal and under the law and celebrating multiculturalism. On the other hand, enforcing Russian language and Russian culture majoritarian policies, creating tensions between Christian and Muslim majority communities, and attempting to also create deliberately mismanaging the actual territorial control even more beyond the complications that had already existed from Russia-backed historical reasons. So all of
Sorry, again, quick curiosity. You say the Soviet government was manipulating all these things for their own purposes, but when this process started of expulsions of ethnic Azerbaijanis from what was Armenia then, as both of them being Soviet republics, did anybody in Moscow, the central government, say anything? Did they say, wait a minute, this is against the law. You cannot do this. You cannot expel people just like that because you don't like them. Was there any law back then in the Soviet Union regulating or contemplating any such situation? Did the central government, which I know was weak at the time, was towards the end of the Soviet Union, so they had probably other urgent matters to worry about, but this was a crisis within the Soviet Union. Did anybody in Moscow say anything or try to do anything regarding this refugee crisis or not?
No, to some extent, Moscow actually encouraged these tensions because this sort of ethnic-based nationalism that involved these ground policies resulting in expulsions created a welcome distraction from the broader nationalist movements that were pushing for separation from the Soviet Union. So because the Soviet Union at the time was facing multiple such crises, including in the Baltic states, including later potential problem with Ukraine, they actually preferred there to be on the ground tensions, because while people were busy killing each other, expelling each other, or fleeing, or being afraid for their lives, they had less focus on separating from the Soviet Union and had less ability to do that. So the crisis actually played into Moscow's overall policy and concerns at the time, which is why
I'm sorry,
they didn't intervene.
if I insist on this, for me, because I'm trying to understand which positions were there. So, okay, I understand Moscow's policy and political objectives and gimmicks and whatnot. But say the then authorities in the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, who were confronted back then, still all of them Soviet citizens, with this sudden influx of refugees coming from neighboring Armenia. Did they appeal to Moscow? Did they say, hey, do something? Or did they say, okay, it's our problem, we got to fix it on our own locally? I'm talking about the then Azerbaijani authorities still under the old Soviet Union. Did they do anything? Did they try to get relief from the central authorities? I understand you just explained the central authorities were not interested in alleviating the crisis. In fact, it served their purposes politically. I get that. But did the Azerbaijani authorities at the time complain with Moscow, or was that they say, okay, anyway, it's useless, they're not going to do anything, so let's try to deal with the issue on our own? How did it go at the time? Is that any?
I appealed to Moscow. They certainly did, but their success was very limited, and they grew to be disillusioned. Basically, the Communist Party was concerned with its own interests, and the local communist parties in all these places had a very complicated relationship with the central authorities in Moscow. They struggled to maintain their own autonomous control. Remember that the leaders of those regions were state appointed, but at the same time, they also had a loyalty and links to the local populations, Armenian and Azerbaijani in their respectively. So they had to balance between serving Moscow's interests and also serving their own communities. And this balancing act came at a cost. So Azerbaijan started with very cautious appeals for support to eventually becoming increasingly defiant as the Karabakh conflict escalated and Moscow's response was either inadequate or, as the Azerbaijanis saw, was completely biased in favor of the Armenians. So what happened initially? Azerbaijani officials and intellectuals appealed to the Soviet leadership to uphold the territorial integrity of the Azerbaijan SSR, the Autonomous Republic, as they called it. Once the Armenian SSR, the official Armenian structure, and the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, which was the enclave that became the separatist region created within Karabakh in Azerbaijan, began pushing for unification as they did. As I mentioned, the Azerbaijani Supreme Court condemned these moves as unconstitutional and sought intervention from the central government because, as you underscored, this violated the official Soviet law. These appeals were framed in very strict legal terms. They emphasized the Soviet law and the principle of republican sovereignty. However, that obviously didn't work.
Okay.
And so the Azerbaijani Communist Party at the time was trying to be basically a liaison between Baku and Moscow. It tried to use its own bureaucratic channels when official legal appeals didn't work. They tried to use bureaucratic channels, insider talk, to resolve the issue. They emphasized Azerbaijan's loyalty to the Soviet Union, adherence to party discipline. There was someone named Kamran Bagirov. He was the first secretary of the Azerbaijan's Communist Party until 1988. He was very cautious, and frankly, he was criticized afterwards for being ineffective in responding to the growing unrest. His administration was criticized for being excessively passive in the face of what was seen as Armenian mobilization and for failing to protect Azerbaijani interests in Nagorno-Karabakh. So Bagirov was eventually replaced by Abdurrahman Vazirov, who was appointed by Moscow in 1988 because Moscow at that point tried to restore control. Vazirov was a career diplomat and he had little domestic political base, unlike his predecessor, and he tried, as I mentioned, to balance loyalty to the Kremlin with increasing nationalism in Azerbaijan, but he was not able to address the violence against Azerbaijanis in Armenia, and he was seen as detached from local realities in favor of broader Soviet issues, and he was extremely unpopular. He was not taken seriously, and his tenure showed the growing disconnect between the Soviet center and the Azerbaijani society. So the Azerbaijani Communist Party failed to assert itself during the crisis and discredited itself in the eyes of the public. By the time early 1990s came in, it already lost the monopoly on political legitimacy, and this is how the Azerbaijani Popular Front, the independence movement, started growing in numbers. There were also other nationalist movements, basically with the same agenda, and they eventually rejected the Soviet authority altogether. So what happened was they started mobilizing the grassroots population when they saw that Moscow could not be counted on at all. The Azerbaijani Popular Front was officially founded in 1989. It became a dominant political force advocating for national sovereignty. It also pushed for a cultural revival and a firm stance on Karabakh. It was initially modeled on the movements that were breaking out in the Baltic republics, which I mentioned previously. And it combined intellectual leadership with mass mobilization, organizing protests, strikes, and civil disobedience. But its rhetoric evolved rapidly from calls for greater autonomy within the USSR to demands for full independence, and it started to frame the Karabakh conflict not just as a territorial dispute, but as a civilizational struggle between Turkic Muslim Azerbaijanis and Christian Armenians, and also started digging into that history of the manipulations to underscore the importance of basically defending that sovereignty. And this was a huge break from the Soviet language of proletarian internationalism, and was very much exemplifying this new nationalist discourse that became prevalent in Azerbaijan. And so by 1991, it was the leading nationalist movements in Azerbaijan. It played a key role in the official declaration of independence in October of that year, months before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And also, it reflected a transformation within the Azerbaijani political identity from Soviet republicanism to a very assertive form of nationalism. So what happens is that Azerbaijan began seeing Moscow as having betrayed it. And the mass expulsion of Azerbaijanis, which met with no reaction from the center, was seen as part of that betrayal. They saw the Soviet institutions as having failed Azerbaijani citizens, and all of that contributed to a narrative of both victimhood and resistance, which continues playing a role in the official foreign policy and legal claims to this day.
So
So,
let me, again, let's try to understand, because thank you, you provided an enormous amount of detail and thank you, and history, very graphic, very granular. And I hope this is useful for our audience to understand the circumstances surrounding these issues. But so the long and the short of this is that, correct me if I'm wrong, did you say around 200,000, maybe more?
I would say over 200,000 at the very least. Yeah.
Okay, so even though we understandably we may not have, finite real numbers, but around 200,000 ethnic Azerbaijanis who had lived for a long time in what was then the Soviet Republic of Armenia, were evicted from their homes and everything, and they had to take basically nothing with them and move out. And of course, for them, the most logical place to move would have been across the borders, which at that time were not political borders, but they were the borders of the two Soviet republics. Then they became borders, but because when everybody gained independence, when the Soviet Union eventually collapsed a few years later. And so, can you tell us a little bit about what happened to these people? You said the Azerbaijani government at the time was seriously under-resourced, understandably. Today, Azerbaijan is a much more affluent, country with a lot of assets. Back then, not so much. So what happened to these people? So they were refugees. They had to move from their homes and villages, small towns, wherever they were, go into Azerbaijan, and then what? What happened to them? Did they find the local authorities provided, I don't know, homes, jobs? How did that work? I'm sure it was a difficult resettlement. Any details that we can have regarding this unfortunate history? How many? So, but we talk about roughly 200,000, maybe more people having to move.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, what happened to them? They just found a new life and moved on, or what kind of hardships did they have to endure to do this transition?
So the process for them actually started a little bit earlier than the peak of the crisis and lasted a little longer than the breakup of the Soviet Union, because some of these expulsions, the remnants of the community, continued to be expelled even after the fall of the Soviet Union. So basically, for the refugees, the crisis was actually between 1987 and 1994. Once they arrived basically it was between 200,000, but by the time of 1994 it was closer to 250,000. So once they arrived in Azerbaijan, they were initially housed in emergency shelters because, as I mentioned, there was not sufficient housing due to lack of resources. They stayed in schools, dormitories, and even public buildings. Some of them, many I would say, were relocated to tent camps or makeshift settlements. Basically, when you envision a typical refugee camp, this is where many of these people stayed. The scale of this, by the way, remember this was not the only crisis Azerbaijan was dealing with at the time. They were also facing the displacement of over 700,000 IDPs from the Karabakh War, which was strictly speaking inside Azerbaijan proper, and they were struggled to provide adequate housing, employment, and services. So finding employment for these people was very difficult. By the time of the early 2000s, Azerbaijan started a large-scale resettlement initiative. Tent camps were abolished by 2007. So, yes, to make it clear, some of these people stayed in the camps for over a decade. And new housing complexes were being built all across the country, not just in Baku. They were basically eventually integrated into the Azerbaijani society, although many remained in horrific economic conditions and retained a sense of loss and injustice. And according to Azerbaijan's 1998 citizenship law that was passed in response to this situation, all these refugees were eligible for citizenship by 2001. The UNHCR estimated that most had either were naturalized or were in the process of getting Azerbaijani citizenship, which allowed them direct access to education, healthcare, and employment, but certainly did not resolve their claims for return or restitution from Armenia. Still, many refugees continue to identify as displaced persons. Their ancestral homes, cultural sites, cemeteries in Armenia remained inaccessible, and no formal restitution or compensation was ever offered by the state. So eventually, advocacy programs began to emerge on behalf of these people. Institutional speaking, one of them is called the Western Azerbaijani Community, advocating for their right to return to the ancestral lands, and it has gained international support, including a 2025 resolution from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which affirmed that right, which kind of brings us to the legal issues here.
Yes.
Now, and that's where I kind of transition to the second part of the discussion, and I'll try to keep
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah. So again, to clarify, because there's a lot of information here for our audience. So now we got the background, the facts, the history, the dynamics, which understandably are quite complicated. But now thanks to Irina's, knowledge of the law, let's see, in terms of international law, there are rights of refugees, and that includes, among other things, the right of return. So that's really the meat of the matter here, and which may apply or should apply to those people forcibly evicted and their families. Some of them, this was many years ago, I'm sure many of them died. That's the end of that. But their families, their children, or maybe grandchildren, are still entitled to the rights they were denied to their parents or grandparents back in the days that Irina explained to us. So please go ahead, Irina, and explain to us lay people, what law, in terms of what principles of international law could and should apply to this situation. And by the way, other situations similar to this in which refugees at some point may want to go back to the place that used to be their home. Go ahead, please.
with some of the general principles, and then I'll give two fairly recent case studies that touch on some of the similar issues. So the right of return is a very well established principle in international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 13, sub 2, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 12, sub 4, affirm that individuals have the right to return to their country. These provisions were originally conceived in the context of state citizenship, but their interpretation has been expanded to include displaced persons and refugees, especially in cases of forced expulsion based on ethnicity or conflict. That's to answer your earlier question about whether does it make a difference that they were Soviet citizens and that Armenia and Azerbaijan were not states at the time. So yes, originally it was conceived as having applying only to states, but because of so many cases, as we discussed, and so many territories where, Yugoslavia is another case with similar circumstances, that the definition was basically reinterpreted and expanded. In the case of Azerbaijanis expelled during the late Soviet period and in the early years of independence, the right of return is framed as a corrective to ethnic cleansing. Historical records show that Azerbaijani communities were forcibly removed from Yerevan, Zangezur, Gocha, and other regions. There was a factual record of property takings. These expulsions were not isolated incidents that were basically spontaneous, but part of a broader pattern of demographic engineering aimed at creating an ethnically homogeneous Armenian state. So that's a state policy and not just unfortunate incidents of grassroots violence that, sometimes unfortunately happen. International humanitarian law, especially the Fourth Geneva Convention, prohibits the forcible transfer of populations during conflict. Although the displacement of Azerbaijanis was complicated by the fact of the post-Soviet context, the principle still applies. It applies no matter how simple or complicated the circumstances are factually. The convention also obligates states to facilitate the return of displaced persons once hostilities cease, especially when displacement was caused by discriminatory or violent means, which arguably this is what happened. The International Court of Justice has accepted jurisdiction over Azerbaijan's claims under the International Convention for Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, known as CERD, which prohibits policies that results in expulsion of ethnic groups from their homeland. If ICJ finds that Armenia's actions constituted racial discrimination, it could mandate reparations and facilitate return mechanisms. It has the power to do so. It has made restitutional claims for various other groups, historically speaking, but the decision has not yet been made. It is likely to be a very long and tedious process with many challenges, appeals. And Armenia, by the way, has made similar counterclaims about alleged expulsion of Armenians. So that makes this whole situation even more complicated. So the legal foundation for the right of return is not just moral, but it's codified in very much binding international instruments. But translating those principles into enforceable outcomes amid ongoing political tensions and mutual distrust is going to be difficult.
Sorry, again, if I interrupt you, because you just mentioned, I think it's important to clarify this, because of course there is an Armenian side to this story. You say, Armenians making counterclaims. Obviously, the whole dispute and the illegal occupation by Armenia for decades of the Karabakh region, creating at this point internally displaced people, because these were people in Azerbaijan who had to go someplace else because Armenia had illegally occupied militarily by use of force a huge chunk of the country. I have seen with my own eyes, because I was there, the complete destruction. I mean, this is way after the fact, of practically everything, every building, every village, every house. There was nothing left. And so obviously all these ethnic Azeris were removed, had to go because of fear for their lives. But then there is this last chapter, which I think it's important to elucidate, which is probably where the counterclaims, maybe there's more, originate, which is the final, reunification of the entirety of Karabakh, and that happened because it was a very brief conflict, one day, something like that, and then the Armenians realized that they had no chance, and basically they surrendered. But as a result of that, those who had lived in that small enclave for many years on their own, again, please set the record straight for everybody here, decided, oh, we can't live here. We're surrounded by enemies. The Azerbaijanis hate us. We can't stay here. We will never be able to live a normal life if we are under Azerbaijani sovereignty. And so they fled. The Azerbaijani government has maintained all along, they did not evict anybody. They did not forcibly remove people from their homes. And indeed, if those people who are now in Armenia would decide to come back, they're welcome. Please explain that so that we have some balance here, as long as they recognize, which is critical, that they would live under Azerbaijani sovereignty, which is no surprise. But they would be safeguarded as a minority, Armenians, and be able to do whatever, as long as they would live under Azerbaijani law. Can you explain that? Because people would say, well, tit for tat, the Armenians did this to Azerbaijanis, the Azerbaijanis did this to the Armenian. It's the same thing. Everybody has faults, everybody has rights, but it's the same story. Please elaborate a little bit. I just expressed it maybe somewhat in crude language, but you know a lot more than I do about this. Is that more or less what happened, or are there other details? And do the Armenians have a valid claim regarding forcible expulsions and the inability to come back to their homes?
So here's the situation. I think people are not aware that the leaders who were governing this territory, the so-called Nagorno-Karabakh Oblast, which the Armenians called Artsakh, and which is part of Karabakh, in recent years, they were literally Russian appointed individuals who were not even Armenians from Armenia. One of them was literally a Russian Armenian oligarch who eventually gave up his Russian citizenship in order to appear more legitimate. So we're talking about foreign nationals who were literally used by Moscow to essentially continue a problem which would not have been created if not for the Soviet manipulations back in the 80s with creating the structure to begin with. Up until that point, you had Armenians who lived there. They had some, problems with Azerbaijanis occasionally, but there was not anything massive to talk about. Then the Soviets come in, create the structure, give these individuals false hopes of an autonomy within somebody else's territory and create this problem. So these leaders, instead of saying, listen, the Soviet Union is gone, historically speaking, this was Azerbaijani territory, either integrate and continue, get Azerbaijani citizenship and continue living as you have, or you can go back to Armenia if you so wish. They continued pushing for an impossibility, creating an independence which even Armenia proper did not recognize. So I put blame not on the regular people who were brainwashed for decades by their own leadership, but on these leaders with strong ties to Moscow who continued the policies going back 200 years from Tsarist Russia through the Soviet Union and, in the post-Soviet period to this day with Putin's direct hand in all of this. I put blame on them for creating the impression that they were entitled to something that they were not and could not pragmatically have under any circumstances, and that would never have been recognized by anyone in international law. There is no country on earth that recognized this enclave as an independent state or as an Armenian territory. They were assorted
Let me do this.
groups.
Sorry,
Mhm.
sorry to interrupt again, but just to make this absolutely clear for everybody, and again, myself included, as a foreigner observing all this and trying to understand, the circumstances and try to be fair to all sides in this very complicated and, as you explained very well, ancient problem of ethnic. Right, I guess I don't know if I can say rivalries, but when you put people here and there, and then of different language, different religion, you create the ingredients for problems later on. But if today, okay, Armenians who fled because they say they feared persecution from that region, the last outpost, if you wish, enclave, they fled. About 120,000, I think it was, more or less. So they fled to Armenia, saying, we can't live here because we will be persecuted. If the Azerbaijanis come here, they hate us, they're going to kill us all. So we flee. And if today or tomorrow, those same Armenians would say, okay, on second thought, we would like to go back to where we came from, to our towns and villages and what have you, accepting that that is sovereign Azerbaijani territory, we would live as Azerbaijani citizens, but enjoying our own autonomies, the right to speak our language, to practice our religion, etc. Is that doable? In other words, should they decide, should they ask for that? Are there mechanisms in place within the government of Azerbaijan to make this possible? To say, okay, fine, as long as you accept sovereignty, that you live in Azerbaijan and abide by Azerbaijani laws, you're welcome. Is that a realistic scenario? Should those Armenians who fled, this is very recently, claiming persecution, decide that they want to go back, so exercise their own right of return? How does that work? Are there mechanisms in place for this to
Absolutely. If they recognize Azerbaijani citizenship, Azerbaijani sovereignty, they can become citizens and be like anyone else inside the country. And by the way, there are other Armenians and other Christians living throughout Azerbaijan. There's 500,000 Christian citizens inside the country. There are Armenian churches and Armenian presence in other parts of Azerbaijan. So they would be treated exactly the same as those individuals. But the problem is, first of all, 150,000 is a grossly hyperbolized number that was used for propaganda purposes by the very same leadership that is now on trial. And that lied to its own constituents and essentially fabricated a threat and encouraged people to leave and created a false perception that they would be persecuted otherwise. In many cases, however, people were not really afraid, they were just uncomfortable. They didn't want to stay there, they preferred to live in Armenia, as is their right. But the fact is, there was no actual threat. Nobody was trying to kill them, to confiscate their properties, or to destroy anything any of their sites. That
So
is
again,
simply
this is
not true.
important. This is important for everybody to understand. When those people fled from this the region that they call Artsakh, and after this extremely brief conflict, and they decided to flee to Armenia, was there any situation of Azerbaijani authorities, law enforcement, military, police, whatever, going door to door in the villages and say, hey, you got 2 hours, pack and go, because otherwise there will be consequences? Was there any intimidation or cases of intimidation, or maybe even here and there somebody saying, oh, we're not safe here. We got to go because they're coming to get us. And we are forcibly removed from our homes because the Azerbaijani military or police or equivalent authorities are going literally door to door, telling everybody to leave immediately. Did
No,
anything like that happen
nothing
in
like that.
Azerbaijan?
Nothing at all. Nothing at all. And frankly, even the people who fled to Armenia and who were later interviewed about it could not describe any such incidents. They just talked about being afraid, or they created fictitious stories about the Lachinko roads being allegedly blocked off and so forth. That also did not happen. There was absolutely no documentation of that. There are satellites now that produced photos. The roads were clear, nobody was stopping them, nobody was preventing them from leaving, but no one was also encouraging them to leave either, other than their own leaders. So if anyone is to blame for creating a mass panic, it's those leaders who were trying to create a propaganda campaign and forced people into exile that was completely unnecessary. Moreover, it wasn't 150,000 people, it was less than 90,000 by all accounts. So the numbers again were hyped specifically to create an impression of a mass problem equivalent to what happened to the Azerbaijanis. Obviously, it was actually a lot less.
Okay, let's jump because we have just now a little bit of time left, but let's jump again back to the main subject, which is these forcibly removed people, which go back now to the late 1980s, as you explained to us so well. So what lies ahead now? You said there are actions or initiatives underway to see that their rights or their families' rights, in case those people, deceased, some of them died, obviously, it's been decades now. So what's the state of play right now? What can they, these communities, who are now mostly, I imagine, in Azerbaijan, expect? Will their rights be recognized by if they are recognized by international bodies, and if indeed they should be entitled to this basic right of return that you explained to us earlier on? How do you see this playing out? Are there at this time active, serious negotiations between the two governments? Now, of course, we're talking about sovereign states, right? The Soviet Union long gone. So there's an independent Armenia and independent Azerbaijan. We know that they have been involved in, it seems to me, very productive negotiations to end this whole story, which is very tragic and very, very, in many respects, bloody and certainly onerous for the people involved. So the two countries are negotiating, which is a very good thing. And hopefully there will be a final settlement to all the issues, the territorial issues, the boundaries, and whatnot. But this particular matter of the people forcibly removed from Azerbaijan, do you see, as the expert who follows in a granular way these problems, not just in this region, but elsewhere, what are the chances of success? In other words, of the rights of those refugees to be recognized, and if they so wish, to be able to return and live as Armenians of Azeri, ethnicity, but live peacefully in Armenia, back in their villages, back in their communities, as they existed way back. Of course, many things I'm sure have changed since then. So how do you view this realistically in terms of having the possibility of a fair, just closure to this aspect of the conflict between the two countries? How do you view this?
I think there are several approaches that are being pursued simultaneously. One is activist and educational, which includes the Western Azerbaijani community pushing for policies recognizing the right of return and restitution and all that. Educationally speaking, there's an effort to educate the international community, to reach out to Armenians and to essentially create the sort of popular understanding. There's the legal approach, ICJ, which is currently evaluating the claims, and frankly, based on the facts, I think it's highly likely to find in favor of Azerbaijan in this matter. I'm just talking about the Azerbaijan case. Armenian case is a separate issue, but I think in terms of Azerbaijan's claims due to the documentation of confiscations and property losses and use of violence, I think there is going to be a finding, and there might be even the legal mechanisms that I mentioned to enforce restitution. There's also the political approach. The current negotiations, which include a demand from Azerbaijan that Armenia should revise its constitution to account for this issue, because currently the Armenian constitution does not have any mechanisms to redress the expulsion of Azerbaijani citizenships from the past. So in the event that the constitution is revised, that would be one mechanism. Is it necessary for Armenia to recognize these issues anyway? No, they could voluntarily and without revising the constitution do so, although that politically would be much more complicated due to internal pressures and external pressures by the assorted Armenian diaspora lobby groups. But yes, technically, it is another option. Again, a less likely option. Simply recognize it as a result of the current bilateral peace negotiations and as part of the negotiated peace agreement to settle on a particular sum and on a political or cultural rights or of access and so forth, or some form of equitable and just redress. All of that is certainly possible. How long that's going to take, unclear. All depends on the Armenian government's political will and the ability to overcome current obstacle. What gives me hope is that I think Armenia is starting to recognize the role of external actors in creating economic and political predicaments for them, and there's in that sort, in that sense, it is finding common ground with Baku. I think, especially on the government level, on the popular level, it may be more of a difficult story, but even there, I think against a common enemy, a common threat, even implacable and intractable issues can be reevaluated given the imminence of other concerns at the moment. So yes, I think it is possible to resolve by political means. And I think it's going in that direction, albeit slower than most people would want, given the decades that have passed and the decades of resentment, bitterness, and distrust that were created by the situation. I think the more history unravels and becomes clear who is really at fault for this entire situation, I think the more people are likely to try to make peace with the past and to turn towards a more hopeful future, which means less focus on strictly legal side of the issue and more good faith and goodwill, political goodwill in resolving, overcoming obstacles and finding reasonable compensation, reasonable a sense of justice and a sense of having a common ground to move forward.
Do you think, again, not to belabor too, first of all, thank you for this, but do you, from the way you see it, based on what you know and how you're following the evolving of this complicated matter, do you think that now there is the political will on both sides to find common ground and to find an equitable, fair resolution to all these issues, starting with this one that we've been discussing today, thanks to your expertise and knowledge, which is rather old. I mean, I know it goes back to centuries. I understand that's really, really old. But in terms of more recent history, this issue of the people forcibly removed and their descendants and their claims. So do you think that both sides have enough common sense, flexibility, and a desire for reconciliation of the two countries after so much fighting? That are you hopeful? That's the bottom line. Are you hopeful that in point of law and point of politics, that the outstanding grievances, we know they can be resolved, we know that, but is there enough common ground, do you believe, between the two sides to make this an achievable goal within reason, within reasonable time, not in 20 years? Do you think that's possible, or that's likely to happen based on what you know?
I think so. I'm becoming more hopeful with each day because I think both sides are becoming a lot more pragmatic. Azerbaijan sees it as in their best interest to to integrate the region. It's beneficial economically. It's beneficial socially, and certainly beneficial politically to stave off much bigger threats. And frankly, Azerbaijan now has the leverage to stand up for its own interests that it didn't have 20 years ago, or even 15, or even 10 years ago for that matter. Armenia is also kind of trying to orient towards the West. I think the government there is tired of being a colonial project of bigger powers. I think it's looking for economic relief that is only possible from manageable relations with its neighbors. And I think as much as it's facing pressures from assorted internal factions and external pressure points, the only way for it to survive is actually to move towards this integration. I actually think that this is the biggest hope, that the fact that their own political survival depends on this path and on support from the West for these initiatives. And the West is very supportive of integration. It's in everyone's interest, and everyone wants to see a united front in the region. So I think it's going to happen, and I don't think it's going to take 20 years, but it will require a lot of support, and it will require a lot more diplomacy, a very active diplomacy, because those obstacles still exist. I won't lie. It's still not an easy situation.
Understood. I think we really reached the end of our time. Do we have any? I think I saw something. No questions? Okay, never mind. So we're good. So listen, Irina, thank you so much for your very broad, detailed explanation of what are admittedly very, very complicated and, I suspect, emotional issues for the parties involved. It's understandable when people are dealing with homes and identity, religion, language, places. These are very, very, emotional issues, understandably so. And so one has to be, one has to take that into account. But as you're saying, looking forward, peace in the Caucasus region is about reconciliation of all parties, and that can lay the foundations of cooperation and much more significant economic development, foreign investments. People talk about the Caucasus being a crossroad between civilizations, from Central Europe to Central Asia, from the Middle East. There's a lot going on, from trade, energy. We're not going to get into all that now because we don't have time. But I think all this is largely predicated on peace, and lasting peace, which is based on trust. So hopefully the parties are well on their way down this road, and again, with the expectation and hope that those whose rights were denied recently or long ago will find some relief and satisfaction and understanding, and that everybody will be at peace. I guess that's the best wish we can have. And I would like to thank you, Irina, so much for lending your knowledge and expertise to this meeting today. And hopefully this will be useful for many to understand the complexities of a very complex and war-torn region. Of course, there are many others. We know that, but this is a particularly complicated one, and we appreciate your help and your knowledge in guiding us through this maze. So with that, we thank you very much, Irina, and we stand adjourned. For all of you who followed us, many thanks, and until the next meeting. On behalf of the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University, I am Paolo von Schirach, the president of GPI and a professor of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University. All the best.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.